a melting landscape. Atmospheres and Disturbances registers the changes in high-altitude ecologies caused by increasing global temperatures. The composition is based on fieldwork undertaken at the High Altitude Research Station at Jungfraujoch, Switzerland, where for 4 weeks I deployed various recording devices around the station and in the surrounding alpine environment to register natural, anthropogenic and geophysical forces. The project provides new encounters of an endangered alpine environment to enhance the way we perceive and engage with notions of place, community, and environmental dissonance. Jungfraujoch is the saddle between 2 mountain peaks, Jungfrau and Monk, in the Bernese Alps, on the boundaries between the cantons of Bern and Valais. Since 1912, it has been accessible by cogwheel railway from Kleinscheidegg, running partly underground in a tunnel through the Eiger and the Monk. The railway terminates at Jungfraujoch, which at an elevation of 3,454 meters makes it the highest station in Europe. The High Altitude Research Station at Jungfraujoch is located on the south slope and is accessible from the railway terminus through a tunnel. The research station includes several buildings, including the Sphinx Observatory, which provides a viewing platform. The research station was inaugurated in 1931 and comprises 5 laboratories, a mechanical workshop, a library, a dining and recreation room, a kitchen, 10 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms with shower, and the custodian's apartments. The Sphinx Observatory has an astronomical dome, laboratories, a workshop, 2 terraces for scientific experiments, and a weather observation station. The data generated by the HFSJG's instrumentation is used to inform the policy direction of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The Great Aletsch Glacier originates at Jungfraujoch and is the longest glacier in Europe at approximately 23 kilometers long, 1.5 kilometers wide, and 900 meters at its thickest point. Aletsch is one of the most extensively investigated glaciers in the world through long-term measurements of changes in length, mass balance, and volume undertaken since the mid-1800s and used to provide evidence of the impact of climate change. The exploration of permafrost is also playing an increasingly important role in which temperatures on surfaces and within steep cliffs and measurements of ice and snow cover together to provide insights into stability of rock faces. As Jungfraujoch is above most sources of air pollution, the HFSJG is well positioned for measuring the composition of the atmosphere. Of particular interest is the concentration of the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide, which has been continuously measured since 1986 in efforts to determine how human-made carbon dioxide is distributed to the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the ocean, to gain more knowledge on air quality, sources of air pollutants, and climate change. During fieldwork, I used different microphones to record a variety of acoustic, spatial, atmospheric, and vibration-based phenomena. Omnidirectional microphones registered wind, snow, and ice, as well as social, material, and industrial sound emanating from the nearby train terminus and viewing platforms. Hydrophones were placed within water and ice to record geophysical sound resonating within the frozen environment of Jungfraujoch and the adjacent glacier. The recordings captured the pervasive presence of anthropogenic sounds permeating throughout the landscape produced by tourist, transport operations, and recreational sports. Accelerometers were attached to various surfaces and structures to record solid vibration generated by high velocity wind and the process of melting and freezing. The recordings produced by the accelerometers clearly express the stress and fatigue occurring within the material structure of buildings and infrastructure. Additional sound recordings were produced around the base of the mountain range to capture related habitat, glacial calving and snowmelt, and additional anthropogenic sound caused by tourist operations, agricultural producers, and ambitious new building projects. These recordings provide a wide sample of the diversity of sounds occupying the Bernese Alps to demonstrate the pervasive nature of human activity. The recordings also reflect the changing ecology of the high alpine environment transformed by the increasing temperatures, accelerating the contraction of the Great Alptesh Glacier, as well as causing instability upon the mountain topology through the loss of permafrost. The precariousness of the degrading environment is underpinned by the increasing rock and ice falls, while crevices are becoming more common around the head of the glacier due to decreasing snowfall. Atmospheres and Disturbances is designed to place audiences deep inside an extreme environment to afford embodied experiences of an alpine ecology under duress. Within the composition, the cold, dry bise wind and the warm downslope foam wind converge to express the precarious nature of life on the exposed ridge. It also offers an encounter with the specialist scientific instrumentation used to measure upper atmospheric gases, which are central to understanding the long-term consequences of carbon dioxide discharge. Inhabiting these extremes in the research station itself, transformed by extreme climate and dynamic weather systems. The project builds on work currently undertaken in the fields of acoustic ecology, bioacoustics, sensory ethnography, and environmental science, whereby sound recordings and composition are used to transform the understanding and appreciation of endangered habitats in order to advocate for their preservation. It is within this framework that Atmospheres and Disturbances offers a portrait of a place in which a future without ice may be a fait accompli. It sounds like its glaciers similarly at risk of becoming mere apparitions within a spectral landscape. Philip Samartzis. So, an unusual opening for a weird music episode, but I felt going straight for context and understanding perhaps paved the way for this album a little bit better than my poorly worded openers ever could. Before we begin, though, I would like to extend a huge thanks to Lawrence English for providing myself with resources for the making of this episode today. So, what we just read was the essay A Melting Landscape by Philip Samartzis, an accompanying essay for the release of the very album we're looking at today, Atmospheres and Disturbances. So yeah, we're of course diving into the incredible sonic world of Smartzis, a sound artist, composer and associate professor in sculpture, sound and spatial practice. And teaches sound cultures in the Bachelor of Arts program in RMIT, I should also say. An incredible individual who's travelled to the furthest corners of the earth itself, recording the most strangest and unusual of sound occurrences, all in the documentation of, the world in these particular moments, just to express these corners that, many of us will never inhabit or go to, essentially. As well, utilising a great number of these recordings in the creation of these incredible album experiences. And across his discography, I should say, Smartzis has created these powerful albums that express the forces of nature, placing us in the epicenters of the sound of the world itself. in his words, to advocate the preservation of these very unusual places. So what is Atmospheres and Disturbances then? Well, this is a 2023 release from Smartzis, released on Lawrence English's Room 40 as a limited edition CD alongside an accompanying booklet of a melting landscape, the very essay just used to open up this episode. This essay, as well as being an essay, this book also features some amazing photography of the surrounding landscape taken by Smartzis himself. So with this album, this is an incredibly strange and unusual release comprised entirely of field recordings at the High Altitude Research Centre in Jungfraujoch, Switzerland. So what we have essentially here, very abstract exploration of strange instances of sound that occur in the most extreme of locations in the very world we live in. An incredibly unique experience, that places us right in the epicenter of this extreme weather environment in this, well, the most remote of locations, right? And what amazes me about this, and why I wanted to try and discuss this on the show, is how Smartzis has created this incredible audio experience, one that weaves together this narrative from the many different sources he collated from his time spent at the research centre. Few albums have expressed to me the sheer force of nature quite like Atmospheres and Disturbances, hence why I wanted to try and discuss on the show. So let's dive into it, shall we? So I should say that, as always, there are albums I do struggle to dissect song by song. It's usually, in those instances when the album experience, it comes across as this free-flowing expression of sound, And with so many of these compositions being a presentation of literal sound all weaved together, from the wind blowing through the research station to the station to the sound of the ice freezing, in our very ears, essentially. It's an audio equivalent of being stood there by the very microphones themselves. The way in which Smartzis have been able to record with such clarity the strange myriad of sounds happening in the most remote of locations. And to me, when listening to this, it all just blurs past like this terrifying story, with ourselves placed at the very centre of it all. And though it is difficult to dissect song by song, I have tried my best here, so let's have a look. It is perhaps fitting, therefore, that Wind is the album's opener. So this is the longest track on the album, clocking it at roughly 15 minutes, and yes, as the name suggests, this is the sound of the very wind itself, steadily blowing, pushing through the building itself as tiny microsound recordings of objects being moved, the rattling of pipes and the very effects the wind is having upon this physical space is just coming through. And one has to just probably imagine as well the constant resonating echoes of such a force of nature occurring so high up in those mountains, where its very forces feel almost amplified here to terrifying levels. Especially with how this composition just rises so slowly, so gradually at first, before presenting a different resonating tone that the wind is now producing. It becomes this odd case, though, of what I would argue or describe as almost naturalistic lowercase drones. But of course, this is just the sound of the wind itself, albeit wind in a very unusual spatial place in the world. For me, it's perhaps the composition perhaps becomes its most challenging when you get the rattling of the very structure itself. When it arrives, it presents itself almost as this strange scraping of metal just rubbing against each other as everything occurring just continues to rise up and up in this terrifying manner. And for me, I find it interesting how you can find yourself drawn towards different instances of sound occurring all around you. The wind, the very shaking of the structure built atop this mountain range, even the rain itself becoming more prominent as it rattles against the metal roofs. It becomes an incredible, remarkable composition of sort, all drawn from the naturally occurring sounds in all of their glory and terror. So to further continue discussing this track, if you don't mind, one part of my fascination with this particular recording comes from how there's a very slow build-up from the album's opener to the end of the composition. Especially with the opener, everything starts off so subtly, and quietly, just the gentle occurrences of the weather itself before it all slowly builds up to this rather terrifying conclusion. And the more it all goes on, the more you feel yourself just almost battling the very forces of the wind itself. Its terrifying power just resonating through the very structures stood atop this incredibly tall mountain. And it feels to me like that wind is ready to just rip you apart almost, send you tumbling down the mountains as it sheds the very structure itself, pulling apart all that metal and leaving nothing behind. The power of nature just being completely not caring about, man-made structures as such, it occurring, as it is and has always done. Now, of course, this is not actually the case, of course. It's just rather how the effects of this sound comes across to me when hearing it, because to me, it sounds like wind like I've never heard it before, and it's, to me, an almost terrifying experience to listen to. Like, something about this one, oddly enough, with how cold it all is as well, like, it really sends shivers down my spine, as though you're literally there inhabiting this physical space that Smartzis is recording. And it is amazing, how he's recorded, this wonderful tapestry of weirdly unique natural sounds, and it's all resulted in this incredibly tumultuous yet phenomenal album opener. Colossal and so vastly fascinating in its own right, and I think as challenging as it is, a perfect opener for this very album experience. So, following on from the very tumultuous opener, we end up exploring, a lot more experimentation of sound art throughout the rest of the album, still sourced from this incredibly peculiar location, of course, though. And so our second track is the second longest track, Station, which opens up with the most pristine sounding recordings of moving water flowing between the very icy sheets themselves. And to me, it kind of almost feels like a simple presentation of a running stream, just hearing all of that naturalistic interaction between the elements themselves, all creating this little micro world of sounds, that are, in a weird way, rather delightful to hear. Especially with this one, where it is the sound of nature itself, just occurring as it does in the world, Something about it is very interesting and just, almost lovely to hear in a weird way, just very gentle, especially after the very tumultuous opening we experienced. To be fair, the more it all occurs, though, the more it all starts to introduce new elements, though, and it gets rather interesting when we get sort of rumbling, echoing drone of a sort of passing plane overhead, or what feels like a passing plane, with its engine just resonating within the very mountains itself, just amplifying those sounds and bouncing across the mountains and echoing it out into the merry microphones some artists use to record it. And to me, it gives the composition this weird gliding sense of narrative, as we then find ourselves within this odd peculiar sound bed of clicks, taps, thumps, and electronic interference, as even the machinery of the station itself at work, creating this unusual lowercase symphony, it feels. And it's odd because it's kind of a meandering set of sounds in an odd way, not in a bad way, but in a kind of unusual way. And it's one that seems to shift in rather more sudden ways than its predecessor, feeling like a bit more like a further experimentation of these very sounds and their various interactions with each other. And for me, it gives the composition this weird sort of momentum that seems to accelerate during these sort of low rumbling lowercase drones and stagger with the more direct sounding taps and clicks. Rather peculiar, but that hypnotizing state of mind that it puts you into is incredibly fascinating to me, especially when I sit down to consider the fact that many of the facets, if not all, of what I am hearing has been sourced from this incredibly remote location, of course, placed high up in the snowy mountains. Now, evident from his explorations there that this is a landscape that is so incredibly rich with such a tapestry of sounds, and so many different kinds of sound as well. You've got the sounds of nature here, but you also have the sounds of humankind, of man-made buildings, machinery, and everything like that occurring within this space that kind of interacts with it in an unusual way as well. It's interesting, interesting. Like, weird tangent to try go over, but I'll try to explain it here. But a lot of how the album comes across to me is you get those naturalistic elements. Like, these are the sounds of this place as it has always existed throughout all of time almost. It's always made these sounds, it's always made this particular tapestry of sounds. But then you have that man-made element that, you know, almost invasively just imprints itself upon this place. The building of this research station, it's tunnels and stations leading up to these places as well, though, and how that kind of results in new sound interactions as a result of human interference. And I feel like, Smartzis here, utilizing all of these different recordings is kind of maybe contrasting it all with each other, and showcasing the natural side, showcasing the other elements as well, and how it's a constantly changing landscape as a result. Maybe anyway. Moving swiftly along, we get to the next track of Melt, which is, in my books, another wonderful tapestry of natural sounds. And so, an immediate opening offers us the sound of running water again, moving through that very ice, creating an oddly peaceful vibe that perhaps feels like a calming balm, especially after the album's opener, and then the odd second track that does lead into more tumultuous moments, of course. It is, though, until you get bombarded by the weather again, the rumbling of thunder as it brings the rain with it. And what I love is how the more it all develops, the more abstract it all seems to become, now incorporating some very fascinating field recordings of the act of freezing and melting within these incredibly large icy structures. And you can literally hear the crumbling decay of the ice itself start to fall apart as it navigates itself down the mountain, And it makes for such a wonderful tapestry of sounds, though, that feel so alien, so otherworldly, and yet sourced entirely from the world that we exist in. And it's so interesting, especially with how it just, that natural physical space, with how wide and vast it all, how the sounds just echo and bounce off of everywhere, though. So what it could even be a small sound occurrence just ends up being so much grander and larger than it ever was. And the way Smartzis has recorded it and presented it here makes for something so incredibly intriguing. I think it's a wonderful experimental composition that really captures that, once again, that dividing line between what is natural and then what is sort of abstract, coexisting between these very two states here. And I have to say, this is, one of those things that I seem to be talking about so much on when it's any release by Room 40, it seems. The contrasting of conflicting concepts, something that is natural and something that is abstract, especially with artists who explore field recordings in their works. This is something that seems to come up so many different times, but something I adore about the record label and something I adore about these releases, the strangeness of these unusual sounds that hardly sound like our world at all, and yet it exists in the most remote of places, it feels. So moving along, we get to the next track of Tunnels, a rather interesting sound excursion that seems to place us in the very system used to transport people across the great distances in these remote places. And so, opening with a station announcement in what I assume is probably Swedish, I don't know for sure, those who do know, let us know. We then go on this literal journey, through the train itself, it seems, navigating such a peculiar sense of lowercase hums and clicks, as the very subtle effects start to build up with something rattling away in the ears. But with this one, you get incredibly subtle naturalistic drones starting to build up again. And we can feel ourselves being transported along that transit system, that sense of motion, expressed to us through these very odd instances of sound itself. And there is, once again, a sense of abstraction to it all, though, as it becomes a little bit more difficult to really place and understand certain instances of what is being heard, whilst other moments feel a bit more easier to understand and comprehend, as though we are capturing that sense of being aboard that train or hearing the sound of the world around us on that train, existing in this remote location. And so much of this particular composition, though, it feels a bit dominated by these unusual and peculiar drones and field recordings, and it makes for something that's a little bit disorientating, but truly fascinating sound odyssey that just is us being taken to the epicenter of this incredibly strange and unusual location. It's rather odd, of course, but especially in terms of how the album has navigated from scene to scene, it places us here in this deluge of windy drones and echoing reverberations in those very small tunnels itself, though. And it's like, especially with how we've navigated across this entire album, at this point, it feels like we're occupying places that is both a bit familiar to us now, but also completely not of this world in the slightest as well. Like, it's kind of unusual with how Smartzis has constructed these recordings and weaved together all of these various sound instances. It makes for something, especially for a layperson like myself, though, something that's so alien, so unknown to me, something beyond my comprehension, if that makes sense. But it's what I find so interesting about it, what I find so fascinating about this particular album. So, we do move on to the album's final track, Valley. One more experimental sound excursion to carry us towards the end of this very album experience. And this one is another quiet murmuring track that slowly opens with those subtle lowercase droning instances again, really taking its time to paint that picture of where it is we are. Before long, though, we find ourselves in that familiar territory, though, that sound of running water gently flowing through that beautiful landscape. Once again, the crack of thunder brings with it that peculiar effects of the weather echoing throughout that incredibly large and vast landscape with a wonderful natural sound. And to me, it's weirdly lovely to hear, especially with how much clarity there is to these odd sounds in a way. Like the way Smartzis has so expertly, set up these microphones and recorded these really odd, unusual sounds is just fantastic, and it makes it so interesting. Of course, abstraction does seem to make its way into the composition, introduced by the whistle of some system before creating space for the wind itself to just travel through the network and created by those incredible valleys. But just as you start to get comfortable with the wind, you get some gentle chimes start to introduce themselves as well, creating one of the very few oddest musical moments across this entire album, one of the very fewest instances of it across every track we've heard. It's just gently rattling and chiming away with a sort of chaotic randomness, perhaps affected by the very weather itself. Or maybe Smartzis has affected the very recordings and post-production to create this odd musical tapestry to close it off. It's hard to know for sure, but when it comes to albums, it's hard to know for sure these things. I would say likely with Smartzis' approach to recording this album, it probably is just the natural sounds of some sort of chime maybe recorded by his wonderful microphones. But it does create a lovely little motif to end the entire thing on, just the gentle sound of, a form of music, if that makes sense. And it's a nice, quaint way to end it all, though. A gentle guide to something that feels a bit musical in amongst the terrifying effects of the weather. And as well, the power of that weather that we don't actually realise that it truly holds. So essentially with that, we have covered Atmospheres and Disturbances by Philip Samartzis, albeit covered it in a sort of weird, flawed, not really understanding the depths of it, I guess. Like, it a bit off script again. Like, it's just an effect of how my approach to understanding music is, that I don't really understand academic things that much, kind of thing, but I do understand emotions and feelings when I listen to something, which is why I wanted to cover this album, as it is truly one of the most fascinating album experiences I've ever had the fortune to come across. Like, the breadth to which Smartzis has gone to uncover the secrets of these locations, the phenomenal sounds that are naturally produced in these environments, whether in the very whether out the very nature of it all itself, or the aboard the the phenomenal sounds that are naturally produced in these environments, whether occurring out in, the very nature itself, or the sounds that occur aboard the man-made research station. It, to me, creates this incredibly fascinating tapestry of sounds, that he used to build up this very strange work. And as mentioned, it feels so alien to me, though, as well as sounding familiar in other respects, like an expression of the very powers of nature itself, how it produces these sounds if we only bother to hear them, maybe. Of course, not all of us have access to a research station out in the middle of nowhere, but I think you get what I mean, though, about it kind of sounding a bit familiar in some respects, maybe. No, but it is true. So much of what I've heard on this album are sounds that I have never experienced before. And it is thanks to Smartzis' dedication and courage to travel to these incredibly remote locations, record all these strange instances of sounds, that we can now experience it in the form of a rather abstract album experience. And it's hard to know exactly what's the truth be told, what's what, and I feel like how this album's being structured and sort of combining all these sounds in this unique album experience, it gives for us, though, perhaps an expression of some artist's experience right there, and then expressed to us a bit more abstractly than just basic raw field recordings. It's interesting because it's something that's so unique and so different, so full of odd naturalistic lowercase instances that I'm so fond of, as well as naturally occurring sounds, and then man-made sounds, and then contrasting it into this very consideration of the actual effects of, the world itself, of what we as people are doing to these natural places in the world that have always existed, always have these powerful effects. And of course, the consideration of the very glacier itself, it's, very fascinating to me, very fascinating, but also sad as well. But yeah, it is, like I said, one of the most fascinating things I've come across in my many, many years of reviewing music, and it's, yes, an incredibly challenging album experience, and it really forced me to consider the particulars of not just what I'm listening to, but perhaps more importantly, why I am listening to it. Much of what Smartzis expresses on this album and the accompanying essay is perhaps the finiteness of what it is we are experiencing. The disappearing of these incredible landscapes whose sounds are almost beyond our comprehension, it feels. The way that, global warming itself is destroying these very natural places that are just wonderful in their existence. Sad, of course, and difficult for people to wrap their heads around, it seems, difficult to comprehend, but it is the reality of the world around us. It's slow decay as a result of the way it is being treated, of course. And Smartzis has placed us right in the epicentre of the act of these places disappearing before our very eyes and ears, spectral apparitions of what once was, perhaps. And I find it a bit overwhelming, though impactful, incredibly unique, and is difficult to properly articulate, especially for someone like myself, who, as I mentioned, I'm not an academic. I am just simply a music enthusiast, rather than a scholar. But for myself, I always feel like that is, whether you are an academic or not, it's a bit beyond the point, What's perhaps what I feel is important is, the experience of what you get when you listen to any kind of album, essentially. And the whole purpose of this show, why I create this show is, is to just express my experiences of these incredibly strange existential album experiences and how it makes me feel, what it makes me think when I listen to them. And this one here is one that's had a huge impact on me when I first heard it a year or so ago. It's something that I've been returning to constantly since I first discovered it, desperately trying to further understand what is going on here, even if my intellectual and emotional intelligence kind of holds me back at times. But regardless of that flaw of my nature of being, this is something I have an incredible appreciation for. Something that has further opened up my eyes to the world of field recordings and their utilization in the creation of album experiences that feel so physical and transportive to their places in the world itself, as well as expressing a need to really consider what it is we're doing to the world and what is happening to it. Now, for humankind existence has barely been here, and yet we are affecting the world in ways that even we can't comprehend almost. And yet, Smartzis takes the time to express that to us in this abstract experience, like, very unusual, very weird. And so I think with that, we'll be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. Another very long one, but it does sometimes happen, of course. But yeah, as mentioned, I am so glad to have found the time to finally discuss Atmospheres and Disturbances on the channel. Like, an album of field recordings unlike anything I've ever heard before. So incredibly grateful and insightful into this incredibly strange part of the world. And I'll be honest, I don't really know what else to say about it, This has resulted in another strange and, incredibly inaccessible episode of Weird Music, but regardless, I am glad to have tried my best to discuss this album anyway. And I hope you've had you found it interesting to watch. It's interesting because, I don't know if I've done it justice, but, I'm glad to have tried my best to discuss this one. Albums that have profound effects on me are the kind of things I want to discuss on this show. And this album, an expression of Smartzis' incredible fascination with the world, its many natures and forces, and his concern to the effects that we are having on the world, It's something truly unique and fascinating. Once again, a huge thanks to Lawrence English for providing me with some of the resources for making of this very episode. Really grateful for all his help on this one. And for those of you watching, a huge thanks to you for watching this episode of Weird Music. I have, of course, provided links to the album below to Room 40 if you want to check out more works on the label, as well to a couple of websites for further reading if you'd like. If you are interested, of course. But for now, I wish you all the best. Hope you take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.